Hey everyone, we're back. Let me go ahead and update the stream title and stuff. I had to step away for a moment. Justice. Okay, just okay. Bob. Okay. So, that's an introduction to anyone who is sticking around who hasn't been here in the past. We've been going over a series of essays by Kaepernick Publishing called Abolition for the People. It is a series of essays making the case for police abolition. And so here's the link to the overall series. We are on part 7 of 30, which is here. Rights are not justice. So, rights are not justice. Before I get into it, it's written by Talila Lewis. She's a lawyer and author, talks and advocate for talking about issues at the cross-section of race, class, and disability. So this is going to be a little bit of a rough spot for me, to be perfectly honest, because this is still something that I struggle with. Ableism in general is so integrated into our speech. I've managed to get, some words out of my lexicon, but there's still a number of not great ones that I still use from time to time. And the case made by Talila, and I agree with this, is and it's not unique to Talila. It's the sentiment that many leftists adhere to, but she really articulates it well, which is basically a society should be measured by how the least well off or the most vulnerable in it are treated. So yeah, that's my disclaimer up front. If I, in the course of reading this and discussing this with y'all, understand this is a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. I've done what preparation I can, but yeah. I suppose so, Donnie. I suppose so. Alright, so. Rights are not justice. Disability justice is an essential part of abolishing police and prisons. Oh yeah, also want to preface, these readings, I try and offer some commentary and thoughts to them, but also it's intended to be a conversation, so feel free to jump in at any time if you have any thoughts, or want to bring anything up. Yeah. So, okay. So, While it is well known that policing in the United States was originally developed and later honed to control Black and Indigenous people's lives, our movement, labor, speech, ownership, family, and more, most are unaware that disabled people and those labeled disabled have always been primary among the carceral machine's intended targets. In fact, there's evidence disabled people have the most frequent and catastrophic encounters with carceral systems, and ableism has long been central to the nation's economic, political, legal, and social anatomy. Indeed, no social justice issue, including abortion, can be properly addressed without intentionally centering disability and ableism. And no social justice movement can be successful without disability justice at its heart. Okay. Actually, hold on a second, y'all. So yeah, this is definitely something that it makes sense when you think about it, and the news articles and statistics do bear it out. The number of folks who have some sort of mental health condition or what have you, who end up being attacked or executed by police is kind of astounding. And that needs to be a focus. Including abolition. Yeah. Understanding disability, ableism, policing, and prisons. The majority of society has come to understand disability through the lens of whiteness, wealth, and other privileges that actively exclude the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and low and no income people. Importantly, those with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by deprivation, violence, and/or precarity, and indeed these environmental factors and socioeconomic experiences are a cause, complicator, and even consequence of disability. More importantly, one does not have to be disabled to experience ableism. Rather, ableism is a systemic oppression that allows society, systems, and individuals to assign value to people based on their appearance and their ability to reproduce, excel, and behave. Ableism evaluates people on their divergence, whether actual or perceived, from constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. In the United States, these constructions are necessarily rooted, as is the country itself, in anti-blackness, indigeneity, misogyny, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. So this is kind of an interesting one, because it seems like this is it's focused on the United States itself, but this seems kind of inherent in capitalism to me, where your only value is what wealth can be extracted from your labor. So your ability to function in the system and produce man-hours of work is the only metric by which you are measured as a human being, as a thinking and feeling entity. It's an interesting point too that you don't actually have to be disabled to experience ableism, that just the perception is enough to cause that kind of discrimination to kick in. Still, most people in social justice movements are unable to recognize ableism and are unaware of just how ordinary yet lethal it is. But policing, incarceration, and institutionalization, labor exploitation and impoverishment, forced familial separation and deprivation of resources, climate and environmental injustice, and other state and corporate violence disproportionately affect disabled and other marginalized people while creating and exacerbating disabilities. Disability justice is a requisite for abolition because carceral systems medicalize, pathologize, criminalize, and commodify survival, divergence, and resistance. The past and present connections between disability and all forms of carceral violence are overt and overwhelming. Disabled and neurodivergent people comprise just 26% of the US population, but represent up to half of the people killed by police, over 50% of the incarcerated adult prison population, up to 85% of the incarcerated youth population, and a significant number of those incarcerated in medicalized carceral spaces like nursing facilities, group facilities, and civil commitment treatment facilities and hospitals. Whether under the pretense of care or corrections, disabled people are highly represented in all carceral populations. History explains this phenomenon. So these statistics are really overwhelming, like when you think about it. This like 2685 figure is kind of staggering when you think about it. That means that maybe 1 in 4 people are considered neurodivergent in some way, and they're picked up more than 8 out of 10 times. Yeah, I know, Donnie. We're moving through it more, but if you want to look into the article, like these underlined parts, it links to the places where it gets the statistics. If you want to read those more, it's pulling from like the CDC and ed.gov and BJS and such. Yeah. It is, but there's a reason for that. If someone is committed against their will and against their family's will to a nursing facility because the state decided so, is that significantly functionally different than throwing them in prison? You may say, well, it's for their own good. Well, they may disagree. But we'll move along. Because I believe that gets talked about, actually. The United States government and corporations have always used constructed ideas around disability and criminality alongside constructed ideas about class and race to classify, criminalize, cage, and disappear its undesirables. In this way, those in positions of power maintain the white supremacist status quo and create an exploitable labor pool while sowing discord within and across marginalized communities. For instance, it potentially would depend on the situation. I think I think agency is something to strive for, even just in general, against the wishes of the state. Like, but yeah. For instance, mainstream doctors and scientists diagnosed black enslaved people who engaged in work stoppages, property destruction, or theft with dysesthesia Ethiopica, or rascality. Similarly, mere thoughts of escaping enslavement was dubbed drapetomania. I am sure that I'm mangling these pronunciations. They're not words I use regularly. In both cases, these purported mental illnesses could only be had by black people, and could only be cured by yet more unpaid hard labor and insufferable violence. Or take the 1880 census 3D schedule, which described the so-called dependent, defective, and delinquent classes using terms rooted in eugenics, now considered disability slurs, to label people as idiots, insane inhabitants, deaf and dumb, blind, homeless children, inhabitants in prisons, paupers, and indigent inhabitants in institutions, poorhouses or asylums, or boarded at public expense in private houses. They forced institutionalization, incarceration, and sterilization of people in all of these classes was not uncommon and continues to this day, with carceral classifications premised on sex assigned at birth alone serving as a form of eugenics of people labeled criminal and or disabled. It's a lot easier to read the text than to read it aloud. For some reason, the combinations of some of these words I'm stumbling on a lot. But yeah, so this is where it starts getting into the weeds on it, Donnie, is the way that some of these classifications and the prescription for how they should be treated has historically been handled very, very poorly by the state. And it's been to discriminate and to remove them from the population pool. And she does get more into it, but this is where, like, if you're looking for a clean-cut example, and let me rephrase my argument. If you're trying to think about this in terms of, well, the state is just trying to help people, that's great. If it were doing that, there would be no issue. The trouble is, historically, it has not been doing that. So in a perfect system, sure. Actually having places that affected, positive care for those who needed it and wanted it, absolutely. But that's not really what we've been seeing. Yeah, also, which people is it helping? Is it improving the quality of life of the people with the issues? Or is it just removing them from inconveniencing other people? Yeah, that is a very good point, Shalun. Okay, but they also cite this article over here. And they are not wrong. And this one I'm actually going to bring up because I think it's important enough to bring up. So this is recent. Forced sterilizations. This is not ancient history. Between 2006 and 2010, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation sterilized nearly 150 women without required state approval. That's not 1880. That's just between these years. If you want to read more about that, that's this link here. It is some heartbreaking stuff. We've also, of course, covered the ones that not only happened in several of the ICE facilities, but also in that were happening to indigenous populations up through the late 1900s, and probably still go on when possible. There's not a medical reason to do this. It's just trying to remove them from the gene pool. This is ongoing eugenics. There's not really any way to justify it. This was not for their best interest. Right, Shaloon. Yeah, hysteria. Any woman attempting to assert their individuality or wanting to gain some sort of equality or something, was treated with depressants and basically dosed into passivity. If this is not evidence enough, disenfranchisement of people with felony records and people with disabilities can often be found within the same section of law. The exclusion of one group often used to defend the exclusion of the other. What many now call collateral consequences of incarceration, being barred from voting or holding public office even after release, are often still called civil disabilities. Modern coronavirus criminalization, resisting arrests, and disorderly conduct laws, police officers and unions using pseudoscience diagnoses of excited delirium to defend murder all help illuminate the unbroken chain between past and present carceral logics. These warped and circular logics are used to justify horrific exploitation, experimentation, and extermination, and quell public outcry over what otherwise would be deemed indefensible theft of dignity, life, and liberty. The goal of incarceration has always been civic, social, economic, and physical marginalization and death of people who society deems unfit. The categories of unworthy being so intentionally broad and intersected as to be endlessly applicable. The nimble, timeless, and comprehensive nature of structural and systemic oppression demonstrate that power holders deeply appreciate how identities intersect and illustrate why intentionally intersectional responses to state violence are necessary. So this one is an interesting one. There are a number of laws where those who have felonies and those who are considered disabled are painted with the same brush. That's something I was unaware of until digging through this. And, it's possible that there are places, there may be situations where you may need to make an exception for a particular type of disability. This doesn't do that. This just says blanket anyone who is disabled, basically we get to treat them like felons. In so far as their civil rights. And I'm not even convinced that they're should be such an exception of any sort, but it definitely should not be so broad. And yeah. When abolitionists do not have a strong disability justice analysis, systems of incarceration simply recategorize and redistribute people into other violent carceral institutions for other manufactured reasons, often based on purported health, criminality, and vulnerability. Knowing this, we are left no choice but to view carcerality much more broadly, through a disability justice lens. If we fail to fill this gap in our collective consciousness, ableism will continue to be used as an excuse for inflicting violence upon marginalized people under the guise of care, treatment, and rehabilitation. Where disability rights seek to change social conditions for some disabled people via law and policy, disability justice moves beyond law and policy. It seeks to radically transform social conditions and norms in order to affirm and support all people's inherent right to live and thrive. All social justice movements, then, must put the needs of disabled people, especially those at the margins of the margins, front and center. This work begins with unearthing and understanding the inextricable links between ableism and other systems of oppression. Abolitionist movement, to touch on this is basically that society is judged by how its most vulnerable are treated argument. Abolitionist movements must contend with how disability and ableism interact with carceral systems and be committed to abolishing all spaces through which marginalized people are disappeared. Disability rights communities must begin practicing disability justice and disability solidarity, which demand a radical reorientation of our collective understanding of systems of oppression, especially as related to disability, interdependence, and carcerality, and advocates for any other form of racial, environmental, and economic justice must work to understand how ableism interacts with racism, classism, and other oppressions and violence to create, perpetuate, and exacerbate inequalities. Let's see. Example of this with police is how mental health is talked about with POC, people of color versus white people who commit crimes or become disruptive. That's true. That's true. Yeah, with people of color, it's largely said that the community as a whole, like, they were raised in violence, and it's just in their nature, which is absurd. It's just not true at all. Whereas with white people, yeah, it's, oh, well, he had some sort of mental illness, and that's why the kind of obsession with tying high-profile violent acts to mental illness is part of the societal oppression of the disabled. Because, you know, whether that was true or not, that is not really the root cause of a criminal offense. The aforementioned, 26% of the population of the United States population is some sort of neurodivergent. So, is 26% of the population just out committing crimes? No, that's absurd. However, laws are set up such that those who have disability are punished both by being pushed into poverty and not being accommodated in any way in like social spaces and in public spaces. So the fact that they are not actually given space to exist among everyone else means that the neurodivergent and disabled, by existing within our system, are, like the author says, is basically they can make up any sort of infraction they want. Hi, Amy Straza. How are you? Welcome. We're going over disability justice at the moment. And I preface this with saying this is not my strongest suit, so give me a little bit of rope to hang myself with on this subject. I'm navigating it as best I can. But there's a lot here to unpack, and a lot of stuff that I had not considered before. So, such a comprehensive approach would challenge carcerality from its core. No longer could arbitrary concepts of class, criminality, or disability serve as a wedge between disability and abolitionist struggles, for they are one and the same. Like transformative justice and abolition, disability justice fundamentally alters our approach to everything we think and do. It provides meaningful and necessary context for marginalized people's responses to their lived experiences. It helps us politicize our disabilities, love ourselves and others more fully, creatively dismantle oppression, and uplift people who are perpetually marginalized within our own communities and movements. It honors Black, Indigenous, disabled wisdom, builds strong care networks, and develops community and cultural health and healing workers. It helps foreground the necessity of harm reduction and transformative justice, and supplants punitive responses that find refuge in carceral logics and spaces. And it develops the requisite relationships, knowledge, and tools to help us practice accountability advocacy across identities, communities, and movements. This one was interesting to me, especially this segment here. So, in like indigenous cultures, you know, before we fucked everything up with capitalism, where you are only worth the labor that you're only worth the wealth that your employer can extract out of you. Indigenous cultures actually very much honored the disabled among them, or, you know, the neurodivergent among them. They were seers and wisdom speakers and whatnot. And without needing to be paid for it, these people, as well as their elderly, were just taken care of. Not saying... okay. Yeah, neurodivergent, of course, covers dyslexia and ADHD, as well it should. And ADHD is, I can tell you from even my own experience in high school, that kids who would act out because they were hyperactive, well, they would be punished. Space would not be created for them. They would not be accommodated or understood. They would end up being punished, sometimes threatened by our on-campus officer. I don't know exactly the 26% figure. I just know that they cite it from this is right about here. Okay, so 26%. Since, because, you know, I don't want to necessarily get too derailed, but I want to understand where that's coming from. Okay. So they are including a number of people. So they are including those with mobility issues, those with cognition issues, those who cannot manage independent living, so those with hearing or vision impairments, and those who have difficulty even with basic like self-care. It's not incarceration, no. You're correct there. But it does lead to it. And there is a very strong link. Like there's the term school to prison pipeline is a term because of things like this, where students are often set up to fail, especially those we don't want to succeed. So those who are coming from poor, red, black neighborhoods, or those who are disabled. Society doesn't seem to want those people to succeed, so it sets up barriers and it makes things more difficult for them. It punishes them even in school so that they can't thrive, they can't learn, and they can't actually develop so that they're ready to enter into adult life. They get into adult life, and then they have no real recourse. It's not exactly the same as incarceration, no, but I think that it's worth recognizing that connection and, you know, weaving that line through the whole thing. Because if you're just looking for, well, this person isn't being arrested today, no, but that misses a whole lot of context. Exactly, Shalhoub. Exactly. And these things can, like ADHD, a kid who's dealing with that, there are teaching methods that can work with that can help that student to flourish and to make them not feel as though they are invalid and, you know, an outcast. And so that's, in my opinion, what is being called for here. If that makes sense. Worse in school makes problems with finding and keeping jobs that people with severe, leads to poverty, inability to treat their issues, etc. Yeah. It sets them up to fail, hands down, and seems designed with that in mind. So the call to action, I mean, we'll finish out the paragraph here and then we'll shift to that 1 second here. Abolition depends on racial, economic, and healing justice, all of which depend on disability justice. We have an opportunity to bring to the fore experiences of a group that has largely been invisibilized in the abolition movement. Now is the time to challenge dominant narratives about disability, ableism, policing, and incarceration, to invite people to revisit everything they think they know about these interlocking systems of oppression, and to commit themselves to disability justice. Successful abolition strategies will weave communities together by highlighting the ties between oppression that lead to seemingly intractable structural and systemic inequity. Yeah, the term is an interesting one, but is tragic at the same time. So, to me, Donnie, this the call to action is largely the same thing as we've been talking about, right? Like, punitive systems and just trying to kick people for existing for whatever perceived slight, whether it be skin color or the way they think and the way they act, that has to just be dropped from our social collective. And we do need to shift to a type of society and a type of model which is much more focused on helping everyone to thrive in whatever way they can. So what we've been talking about largely has been people who, like the way we handle crime, stop sending out people with guns, right? Start sending out mental health workers and social services and rehabilitation workers and things like that. This article, was written last year, and it, like all of these 30 essays, is part of the Abolition for the People series. It was commissioned, like the whole thing was organized by Kaepernick Publishing. And it's people from all different walks of life putting in their perspective on the abolitionist movement. So it's kind of expanding all of that to, rather than just focusing solely on the carceral side, also recognizing that there are other systems in play, whether it be how someone who's neurodivergent is handled in school, how they're, or, even like how someone who is physically disabled is accommodated in the broader world. Like, if there are barriers that are being erected to hold them back and keep them from functioning in certain spaces, that's a problem, and that is part of a ongoing social issue. Exactly. And I think that they really hone in on an interesting perspective, which is, if you design a system, if you really come up with a social movement and social system that can accommodate literally the most vulnerable and most marginalized population, which is these folks, then it'll work for everyone else. It solves all of the other problems just inherently, because they face the brunt of multiple angles of attack. Exactly, Shaloon. There are perspectives there, and there's opportunities to recognize other forms, other shadows of systemic oppression that we might overlook even as we're forging ahead working on the racial injustice issues. Yeah. Because, right, like, if you... Thinking about it from like a software development perspective, which I know is a stretch, but hear me out. It's my wheelhouse, so give me some slack here. But thinking about it from a software engineering perspective, like, it's like trying to design a system that can accommodate any user. So if you build the system, so if we were building the system just so that, these groups of people, let me back up my analogy. You have a system, it works for this group of people here, and then another group of people says, well, it's not working for us. So you kind of redo it so it accommodates all of these people. But then there's still yet another group that, if it had been engineered to work for them, it would have worked for all groups across the spectrum. but they're still being left out. You know, that sort of thing. Like from a user interface perspective, that is something that comes up because I actually have had to design a fair bit of software that can be used by those who are hearing or vision impaired. Tree comic. Yeah. There's something like that. Right, Donnie. Exactly. So if you're thinking about it in those terms, but just extrapolating that to like how society functions and how these state institutions function, I think that's where the author Leela Lewis, am I mangling her name? Talila Lewis is going with this. And I think it's a really interesting perspective. It's definitely one that I had not thought of before, and I do recommend, I'll post the link up again, but I do recommend following through, because she links a lot of supporting articles pointing out a lot of these things, and cites a lot of data as well. And you know, you may, even if you take some issue with some of the minor details, yeah, I mean, this is straight up, all of these articles are written with a goal in mind, with a bias in mind. I'm biased. I'm not afraid to say that. That's not a bad thing. The takeaway, though, is what do we actually learn from these? And that's what I've learned from these, is if we treat our worst off and our most marginalized people better, if we build a world together with them where they are equal partners in that world, if we have systems that they have a say in how they're treated, that they have agency in, that is designed to work for them as well as for everyone else, like, it's gonna be best for everyone. I think that's admirable. That's something to work towards. Again, fully admit this stretches my own experience and the things that I have learned about and researched. So there may be things in here that I missed, didn't articulate, you know, as much as warrants. It's definitely a subject that I want to research on some more, but it's a perspective that I am grateful for reading about. Build the world out of Lego. Just don't step on them. Yeah. If you step on it, you fuck your foot up. Oh, yeah. I like that, Chillin'. Okay, so that was Rights Are Not Justice by Talila Lewis. That was the 7th essay of 7th essay of 30 of the Abolition for the People series.